So they've been able to study the variation in the mitochondrial genome and then apply different models to that back into time. And what's interesting is that there was a paper published in the late 1990s where they actually ascribed the origin of this genome to only, if I remember correctly, only about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Wow. And this was actually published in a major journal, and it just really caused the community to freak out. They didn't apply the typical evolutionary time frames to calibrating their data, and so they came up with this young age. And so it's interesting. Of course, we've had many papers published since then that claim much older ages, but still, even 100,000 years is on the evolutionary time scale just
a blip, yeah.
A millisecond of time anyways. But really, a lot of these older time frames that are 100,000, 200,000 years old, they apply a lot of the caveats to calculating these. They calibrate their models with deep time.
So they're kind of forcing the evidence or the data into a paradigm or into a particular perspective rather than letting the data speak for itself?
That's correct. What's really interesting is that there were two studies that were published in 2012, and I've reported on this on our website. People can look this up. But two separate studies where they looked at the variation in the nuclear genome inside protein-coding genes. They call this the exome. So these are just the protein-coding regions of the human genome, which tend to be very stable. There's not much variability in these regions because if there was, it would mess up the proteins and cause all sorts of diseases and problems. And so they just studied these human exome regions at two different studies, and they studied thousands of different people across North America and looked at the variation in these protein-coding regions of the nuclear DNA in your main chromosomes. And both studies came up with a timeline of not more than 5,000 to 10,000 years ago for the origin of this nuclear DNA variation. And so what happened about 5,000 years ago? Well, we know the flood happened 5,000 years ago, and the earth was repopulated through Noah and his family. Mm-hmm. And so this data matches perfectly with the biblical time frame of a great flood and the earth being repopulated through the genetics of Noah and his family. In fact, one paper said not more than 5,000 years ago.
And that's a secular journal, or?
These were secular papers. One of them was in Science, if I'm not mistaken. I think the other might have been in Nature. Now, I'd have to go back and double check. But I've actually wrote news articles on these papers. You can find them on our website.
And that is icr.org, is that correct?
Yes, yep. That is correct. And I actually also published a short paper in a journal called the Journal of Creation Science on this whole issue of human origins and a short time frame on the genetic clock.
Now, just for clarification on this, Dr. Tompkins, just for our audience who generally is not going to be specialized in genetics or how that works, but when you say, okay, we can only go back this far in time, or maximum age, let's say, is 5,000 years, and we know this from genetics, what you're saying is that the amount of diversity that we see within the human genome would take
in these protein coding regions that basically tolerate very little variability. And so what's really interesting is that these papers did not use these deep time calibrations. They did not manipulate the data to fit within these deep time constraints. They just basically used demographics, which is the study of human populations over time and how they grow, and they applied known demographic models of human population growth to the data. That was it. And they came up with about a 5,000 to 10,000 year timeline at the start of this human variation, which fits perfectly with the biblical global flood.
Now,
so that's what's really cool about these papers is that they did not apply all of this hypothetical, evolutionary, constraint to the models. They just let the data speak for itself.